All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, I want to send all of you thank you for your tremendous support. People are slowly but surely finding out about who we are and what we do. They enjoy and respect the passion with which we speak. But as we always say here at Chin Check Sports Radio, we simply do this because we love it, as we are sharing our passions with you all as we continue to build our listening army to take over the world. On this particular episode, we are honoring a request by a good friend of ours and a big supporter of the program who reached out to us directly and wanted us to discuss this particular topic. For the rest of you, it is chinchecksportsradio@gmail.com. Once again, it is chinchecksportsradio@gmail.com. We honor any of our requests, things that you might want us to discuss, and we definitely enjoy doing it. So our good buddy had reached out to us and wanted us to discuss a particular documentary called The Fight of Their Lives that really went in depth with the fight between Gerald McClellan and Nigel Benn. But before we get to that, we definitely want to say, CJ, thank you for the support. We know that you are expecting a new addition to your family. So, brother, God bless you and your family. And we hope that everything works out for you. We know that it will work out for you. So definitely much love from Chin Check Sports Radio. And we hope that you definitely enjoy this program as it is dedicated to you. So February 25th, 1995, Gerald McClellan moved up in weight to fight the 168-pound titleist or champion, Nigel Benn. Now, Gerald McClellan was the middleweight or the 160-pound champion, fresh off of some vicious knockouts. So I really want to set the scene before we actually get to the action where how big of a fight this was back then, because of course as time goes on, as memories fade, as new stars start to emerge from boxing, you always see that the stars of yesterday tend to be forgotten. They tend to be looked over, and this is one of the reasons why we created Chin Check Sports Radio, is that we want to keep the memory of these fighters alive, because again, these guys and women risk so much. They put their health on the line for what they do, and they do it to entertain us. And the fact that oftentimes they're forgotten long after their careers are done is kind of sad, and plus they deal with the lingering effects of the repeated blows to the head. So we definitely like to keep these folks' memory alive, and we're going to try to do our best with this fight, because in reviewing this fight, it was very bittersweet, and definitely more bitter than sweet, but we're definitely going to do our best to bring you quality programming. So Gerald McClellan, going into this fight, was seen as maybe the second or third best pound-for-pound fighter in the world at that time, and was known or was marketed by promoter Don King as a miniature Mike Tyson. Again, Mike Tyson being a heavyweight, Gerald McClellan being a middleweight, so of course smaller in terms of weight, even though McClellan stood about 6'1", 6'2", and Iron Mike stood about 5'9", 5'10". But again, you have a middleweight versus heavyweight, so hence the term a miniature version of one Mike Tyson. The same Mike Tyson who was serving out his prison sentence for rape. So Gerald McClellan was the knockout puncher in boxing. Going into this fight, we're talking 31 wins, 2 losses, 29 knockouts, 14 straight wins by KO. So let this sink in. 31 wins, only 2 losses, and those are close decision losses early in his career. 29 KOs out of 31 wins, 14 straight knockouts. That is pure, raw punching power, and 2 of those knockout victories were against one Julian the Hawk Jackson. Julian the Hawk Jackson is actually considered one of the greatest and, one of the hardest punchers of all time. And I'm talking about along the same lines of our Ernie Shavers, or Sonny Liston. This guy, Julian Jackson, was putting guys to sleep, and Gerald McClellan knocked him out not once, but twice. And the first fight was to win the WBC Middleweight Championship. Knocked him out in 5 rounds. I'm talking about flush right hand. You saw the lights go out. Caught Jackson with the left hook. Stood back up. Crunched him again with the body shot. And the fight was over. They fought about a year or so later. This time, McClellan beat him in 1 round. So you have the hardest puncher, or one of the hardest punchers ever in boxing history, being destroyed by another hard puncher, and that was Gerald the G-Man McClellan. However, in the second Jackson fight, McClellan had problems making weight. He had to step on the scale and then go back to the scale to make the weight limit of 160 pounds. And going into the second Jackson fight, the commentator stated that he went into the ring almost weighing 175, 180, made it very clear that was going to be his last fight at the 160 pound weight limit. So enter one Nigel Benn. Now, after that fight, Gerald McClellan had surgery on his right hand, hadn't fought in 9 months. So y'all let that sink in. Now, Nigel Benn, 31 years of age versus one McClellan who was 27. You can make an argument was just starting to hit his prime or right at his prime. You have one Nigel Benn at 5'10", 168 pounds, or in British terms, 12 stones. 34 wins, 2 losses, 32 knockouts, and 1 draw, making the 7th defense of his Super Middleweight Championship. And again, going in London, England, if you watch the fight, look in the very front row, you see obviously the promoter Don King, who was the biggest promoter at that time. You see at the time heavyweight contender one Frank Bruno, who was a heavyweight titleist. You also saw, if you look very closely, you also see a young Prince Nassim Hamed in the front row as well. So Don King, you had another promoter, Frank Warren, Frank Bruno, who was big time in 95, as well as one Prince Nassim Hamed, who will go to take that mantle as one of the big stars out of British boxing. So in the first round, well, let's go back. Gerald McClellan predicted a first round knockout. Again, this is a Gerald McClellan fighting a shorter opponent with a shorter reach. And obviously you have McClellan with the punching power. Again, 14 straight KOs, and I believe a bunch of first round knockouts. So you had a Gerald McClellan who throughout his career had never ever went past the 8th round. I mean, that's how much devastating knockout power that this guy had. So again, fighting a champion, moving up in weight, fighting a champion, making the 8th defense of his title. So going into the first round, you see McClellan coming out balls to the wall. With about 222, 223 in the first round, 223 mark of the first round, you see Gerald McClellan literally score a knockdown while he's crowding Benn against the ropes, scores a hellacious knockdown, which literally knocked Benn through the ropes. So Benn is on the outside of the ropes, he's still on the ring, has a 10 count to make it. Clearly he gets on his feet by the count of 7 or 8, gets us to the ring right at the count of 8 to 9. So he is up at the 10 count. Even though he fell out the ring, he was still bound by the rules that he had 10 seconds to get back into the ring. Now, if he fell out the ring, it would have been 20 seconds. He had 10 seconds to get back into the ring. He clearly beat the count. As soon as his back fell out the ring, you saw him counting. The referee had picked the count up, so there was no slow count. So at this point now, you see Gerald McClellan just pouring it on. You thought that the first round prophecy would come true. He would get this guy out of here in 1 round. He's swinging everything. The fight was called by Steve Albert and the late, great fight doctor, Ferdy Pacheco. And clearly you see this guy just throwing, trying to get this guy out of here. But for some reason, as McClellan is going on the attack and trying to land punches, the referee, Alfredo Azaro, keeps stepping into the fight. You know, I'm not going to say ruining his momentum, but clearly there was a slight break in the action if he felt he was trying to get control, because again, you have McClellan being very aggressive, trying to go for this knockout, and for some reason the referee kept stepping in Gerald McClellan's way. We even see Don King screaming at the referee at ringside. You hear the late Ferdy Pacheco commenting, "What is this guy doing? Is he refereeing an amateur fight?" Steve Albert says that you have McClellan has to fight the referee off and then go fight Benn. So very questionable officiating by the referee, who was out of France, because again, you have an American fighter and a fighter out of London, England. So to keep it fair across the board, they brought in a fighter, a ref from France. So the first round, you clearly score a 10-8 round to one Gerald McClellan via the knockdown. So now at this point, you would think all the momentum is on Gerald McClellan's side. In the second round, Nigel Benn comes out, lands some hard right hands and some beautiful left hooks. And he clearly now has seized all the momentum in the second round, landing very hard, efficient punches. And a lot of McClellan's style, a lot of his defense was bending over at the waist, shifting over at the waist, avoiding or doing his best to avoid a lot of the bombs that Joe McClellan was throwing. So McClellan, trying to headhunt, not really focusing on body attack, Benn was able to avoid a lot of those big shots in the second round. So after being dropped and knocked out of the ring in the first round, you had Nigel Benn come back and claim the second round, and rather big. Now, hurt McClellan a couple. Well, I'm not gonna say hurt him. Stunned him a couple times where McClellan had to hold off. Now, Nigel Benn's style. If you want to equate a modern day fighter to the kind of style that Nigel Benn fought, think of a cross between a Sean Porter and a Jean Pascal. That really unorthodox style, but a straight ahead style, which was a Sean Porter, always coming at you. A launched, unorthodox attack, some weird angles like a Jean Pascal, bending over at the waist. So that kind of a cross between a Sean Porter and a Jean Pascal, where the upward style would have thrown the overhand rights and the overhand lefts, while McClellan was being lazy with his hands, was making an impact. Also, because as McClellan was tying up and he was throwing these overhand wide punches, he was catching Gerald McClellan in the back of the head. That is illegal in boxing. That is a rabbit punch. So McClellan was complaining to the referee about the rabbit punches, but those things happen. So in the third round, so I gave the second round to one Nigel Benn. In the third round, you had Gerald McClellan landing some shots, even though at first you saw one Nigel Benn landing a good right hand, a good uppercut, but I thought McClellan started to turn the tide by landing short right hands on the inside, and then hard right hands, clearly establishing control back in the fight. In the first round, you saw big rights from one Nigel Benn. And for some reason, I don't know why McClellan was committing a cardinal sin in the fourth round of backing straight up with his hands down and was getting caught. And you saw Nigel Benn landing hard right hands over the lazy jab of one Gerald McClellan. So that was kind of fun to see that. Now in the third and fourth round, you start to see that McClellan is fighting with his mouth open and his mouthpiece clearly not in his mouth, which is rather strange to see. So you see the mouthpiece clearly hanging out. Think of, for instance, for your modern people listening, when you watch the NBA and you see Steph Curry always with his mouthpiece hanging out of his mouth like that, kind of sloppily. Well, in the boxing ring, that kind of shouldn't happen because it'll get you knocked silly. And John McClellan, for some reason, was standing there with his mouthpiece hanging out of his mouth in a rather precarious position, and you start to see that in the fourth round. So you gave the first round clearly to one Gerald McClellan, second round to Nigel Benn, third round to Gerald McClellan, fourth round to one Nigel Benn. In the fifth round, why in the world did Gerald McClellan decide to switch to southpaw? I know he might have been effective at southpaw, but that wasn't a fight to be effective in. And once as he made the switch to fight southpaw, he was clocked with a hard right hand. So you just saw him being outworked in the fifth round. So I gave the fifth round to one Nigel Benn. At this point, we have an even fight on the scorecards, 47-47. In the sixth round, you say McClellan is actually leading with his jab and just leaving his jab out there and getting countered over and definitely getting countered over some lazy jab. So you saw again that unorthodox style, that launching attack, throwing right hands over the jab, was catching one Gerald McClellan. But I thought that McClellan he definitely held his own by getting his own offense in. So I thought that he definitely did a good job there. In the sixth round, now remember we talked about the mouthpiece hanging out, where he was cracked with an overhand right where the mouthpiece came flying out of his mouth. So even though I thought that McClellan was a little bit sloppy in that round, but I thought he did enough to win the round. I thought he seized control in that sixth round in order to win the round. However, the few hard right hands, and specifically the hard right hand that knocked the mouthpiece out of his mouth, is enough to sway the judge's decision, and we actually scored that round even. So we have the fight 57-57. going into the 7th round. Or after 6 rounds, going into the 7th. In the 7th round, Gerald McClellan clearly came out more of being aggressive, establishing his jab. At one point, he got so frustrated by the referee, he actually shoved the referee out the way. But again, he came out very aggressive. Benn had a few spurts, a few flurries at the end of the round, but we thought that he clearly won the 7th round, being the more aggressive fighter, starting to establish himself and starting to establish his jab. In the 8th round, you saw him get flushed, and we're talking Benn. I'm talking about this. McClellan clocks Benn with a hard right hand, knocks him stiff, now at this point has him trapped against the corner, against the ring post, scores a knockdown. So now we have another knockdown in this fight. So again, you see the knockdowns, and at this point, you clearly have him well ahead in this fight. So in the 8th round, again, the knockdowns, as Benn is starting to turn the tide, as he has pulled this fight even, you have one McClellan who won the 7th round, who's now won the 8th round with a knockdown. So now he's clearly ahead going into the 9th round. In the 9th round, it's kind of more the same. You really don't see much. The action is kind of back and forth, seesaw action. Now the 10th round is where it gets interesting and where it gets sad. Clearly, McClellan is clearly controlling the action. But something happened where there was a headbutt, and I'm going to say it wasn't the 9th or the 10th round. It clearly was a headbutt where, again, as Benn is coming, again, who has dreadlocks as his hairstyle, as he charges in to launch his rush attack, he and McClellan, they bump heads. But of course, the top of his head makes contact with the right eye of one McClellan. Obviously, the dreadlocks rubbing into the eye, obviously made contact with the head. And even 9th round, you saw more of the rapid punches. So going into the 10th round, you see Gerald McClellan blinking uncontrollably, just blinking. Something just didn't seem right. Now, again, it's easy to go back and say hindsight 2020. They should have known that something was wrong, but watching that fight live, nobody could have expected what was coming next. So in the 10th round, McClellan gets hit with the right hand. And we're talking about a right hand that he was hit with harder right hands all throughout the fight. He takes the right hand, goes down to one knee. You see him blinking, he gets up, he gets hit again, he gets knocked down. You see him blinking, you see him taking deep breaths, you see him blinking rapidly, you see him taking deep breaths, and the fight is over. And as the fight's over, the crowd is going crazy. The crowd is going nuts. Gerald McClellan goes back to his corner. Then little by little, usually most fighters at the end of a fight, they sit down on their stool while they're being tended to by the cornerman or the ring doctor or, family, friends, whatever the case may be. And as he goes to the corner, now you see Gerald McClellan slump down in his corner. Then you see, as time goes on, the crowd is going crazy. You have one Nigel Benn who survived a 1st round knockdown, an 8th round knockdown, and now you see that he's won probably the biggest fight of his career, probably the biggest title defense. So I guess, as people are happy or celebrating the euphoria of the great victory, at the same time in the ring, you see a fighter going through medical problems. So you hear the Showtime team really trying to, and I thought they did a great job of saying, well, wait a minute, this is a great victory for one Nigel Benn. He deserves the accolades, but something is going on here. As you see, now you see the medical doctors, they get to one Gerald McClellan in the corner. At this point now, he's laid out on his back. It doesn't seem to be even moving. And they put the neck brace on, they put an oxygen mask on him, and Gerald McClellan still has not gotten up. He is still not moving. And at this point, again, now people are now focusing on McClellan because now he's laid out in the corner. He has a neck brace on. This is while still wearing his boxing trunk, his boxing gloves on. So now he has a neck brace on. Now he has a an air mask on or some type of mask for air on his face. Now, clearly this is serious. And you see this and you're like, okay, this isn't right. You know, you've seen guys hurt, but for a guy who was just fighting his heart out, inexplicably took a knee knockout, slumps back to his corner, has not gotten up. And in this documentary, The Fight of Their Lives really goes into the legacy of what happened. Now, people wanted to get on Nigel Benn for his comments, happy that he won the fight. Of course, when you're excited and putting yourself in Nigel Benn's shoes, you're excited, you're happy, you just won the biggest fight of your career. You're in just, euphoria, just jubilation. You get an adoration of your countrymen. So, of course, you're pointing over there saying, look at him, he's hurt. I didn't think there was any malice or ill will towards it. He was just in the moment. Himself walking back to the locker room, he collapses. He says that it's from exhaustion. Meanwhile, Gerald McClellan had to have emergency surgery to remove a blood clot. And the risk and realities of the fight game is Gerald McClellan never fought ever again, was in a coma for a couple weeks, and because of that, was blind, was deaf, couldn't walk, he was in a wheelchair, he never fought again, and this is a guy who was at the top of his game. Now, the trainer that he had in his corner, Stan Johnson. Stan Johnson of sailor cap, captain's cap variety, with the same kind of perm or jerry curl that he had back in 95 in this documentary, came across like a complete buffoon. And the late, great Emanuel Stewart was in the documentary and was talking about, and if you go back and watch the first fight versus Julian Jackson, the first person that McClellan hugged when he knocked out Jackson was one Emanuel Stewart, because Stewart of one the famed Kronk Gym. So, for some reason, and like Manny Stewart said in the documentary, Gerald McClellan just threw him to the gutter and wanted to go with Stan Johnson. They never knew the reasons why. And you could tell this still kind of bothered Emanuel Stewart about what happened between him and Gerald McClellan. And if anybody knows, Emanuel Stewart, at least in our lifetime, is the greatest boxing trainer ever. Yes, even greater than Freddie Roach, the greatest boxing trainer ever in our lifetime, no questions asked. And the late Manny Stewart, again, was clearly still bothered by what happened between him and Gerald McClellan. He was doing his best to be respectful, but you could tell there was still some hard feelings there. Stan Johnson clearly is a downgrade of cornerman. But again, it was nothing that Stan Johnson could really do because his fighter's hurt. And it's something interesting that he said in the documentary when Gerald McClellan walked back to the corner. And of course, you always see fighters pouring water on their fighters' heads and kind of keep them awake, stuff like that. And he stated that McClellan told him that it feels like the same water that you're pouring down my head, I feel it inside of my head. That could have been a bleeding in the brain. So you just see him get worse and worse. And Gerald McClellan, again, was pretty much wheelchair bound, blind, deaf. His sister, and God bless that woman for stepping up and taking care of her brother. Who knows what sacrifices that she had to make in her life to care for her brother. Of course, this is somebody who requires 24-hour care. And God bless that woman. Joe McClellan, from what I understand, is walking with a cane now, even though he still needs assistance. And you saw in the documentary about him having to be led. Now, the sister stated that he wasn't deaf. In fact, he has issues with comprehending what he's listening. So you seem to have to repeat yourself a lot of times for him to understand, but you can tell the real affection and love between him and his sister is genuine. You see the fighter is still in him when he's throwing punches, showing about, hey, let me show you how to throw a punch. I would throw my left hand and my right hand. So you know when there's a fighter's spirit is still there, no matter his state. So we're glad that Gerald McClellan is living his best life. You saw pictures with his grandchildren. His son is actually a professional fighter, ironically being trained by one Julian Jackson. So it's sad to see Gerald McClellan and to see him like that. And probably even feel worse for one Nigel Benn because, yes, even though he made comments, I'd rather having him and not me. But again, this is that, you're in the moment, but you can clearly tell that it affected somebody for you being responsible for a man's injuries in the ring that literally affected the rest of his life. I would expect for it to have an effect on one Nigel Benn, and clearly it did. You clearly saw when they met up, and I believe the incident was actually in 2007. Oh, well, I'm sorry, the meeting or the dinner was in 2007 when they actually met, and you clearly saw when they were talking, and it was so heartwarming. Well, I don't know if McClellan knew that Benn was there, but he said something to the effect to his sister, like, well, he looked sad. Why did he look sad? And it was almost like Gerald McClellan couldn't understand why. And he saw, Nigel been crying off on the side. So it clearly affected him. I truly believe it did. He really didn't do much after that fight. But just to know that, I know in his heart that, the injuries that one fighter, and again, the risk when these guys step into the ring. But even still, knowing, these guys are warriors. These guys are not monsters. These guys are pugilists. These guys are not monsters. These guys are human beings with families. They're just simply doing this to make a living. And to maybe think or to know that you had a direct impact on what happened to this guy. I know it did something bad to Nigel Benn. It had bad to do with his psyche. But we give him all the credit in the world for kind of living his best life. He seems happy. His son is a professional fighter now. So definitely good to see the two of them together. But I really want to leave you with this point. If Gerald McClellan wins that fight, and if we mentioned this before, Gerald McClellan beat Roy Jones as an amateur. And let me give you a quick shout out to Roy Jones Jr. Because Roy Jones Jr., especially in that late 90s, was the best fighter in boxing by far, no questions asked. And was clearly supporting one Gerald McClellan financially. He stepped up to the plate and definitely did what he had to do in terms of medical care and finances for one Gerald McClellan. So we got to give a big attaboy to Roy Jones Jr. But if Gerald McClellan wins that fight, he is a WBC Super Middleweight Champion. Roy Jones won a version of the IBF, or the Super Middleweight Champion, the IBF, by virtue of his win against James Toney in 1994. The two of them would have had a fight. And remember, Gerald McClellan beat Roy Jones as an amateur. Roy Jones is one of the best amateurs that America has ever had, yes, even including one Sugar Ray Leonard. Roy Jones was a victim of the worst robbery in U.S. Olympic boxing history, or I can make an argument of Olympic boxing history. Maybe Evander Holyfield II clearly was whooping the South Korean fighter, and they gave this guy a decision. So again, that Roy Jones Jr., fighter of the 90s, won a version of the heavyweight championship of the world. One of the best amateurs, amazing and just prodigious gifts. One of the best amateur fighters ever. Gerald McClellan beat him as an amateur. What would have happened if Gerald McClellan and Roy Jones Jr. fought maybe that 95, 96 era? Because Roy Jones did not move up to light heavyweight until 1996. So if Gerald McClellan wins that fight, we're getting a super fight between Roy Jones and one Gerald McClellan. And who knows what history would have led us to. Because again, Gerald McClellan was only 27 years old, just hitting his physical prime, just hitting his peak. And Roy Jones, for all of his gifts, was flawed technically. So who knows? It's the ultimate what if. This is no slight on anybody. It's just the ultimate what if, the ultimate fantasy matchup. We would have gotten that 168 pounds version of a unification fight between Roy Jones and one Gerald McClellan, the same guy who beat him in the amateurs. Was 26 in 1995, so we're talking around that same time if him and Gerald McClellan fought. We're talking like 26, 27, 28. Again, you had Gerald McClellan that was 27 years old. So we're getting two fighters who were in their prime or close to their prime. Definitely would have been an exciting fight. You guys got to remember, you also had James Toney kind of still lurking around. His sheer personality, his sheer will, even though he lost the fight clearly to one Roy Jones. But James Toney is James Toney, a spectacular fighter in his own right. During those time in the 90s was kind of the lean years of one James Toney, where he didn't take things seriously, was losing fights that he had no business losing to. So definitely would have been some interesting fights in that 168, or maybe as time goes on, Roy and both McClellan, they might move up to maybe to the 175-pound weight class. So you probably would have had that fight between 168 and 175. And on this fight between him and Nigel Benn, if you take away the tragedy of what happened, that fight clearly was a candidate for Fight of the Year in 1995. It was action-packed from the opening bell, literally, until the knockout. So definitely a great fight. We definitely enjoyed this program. CJ, we definitely hope and you enjoyed it. And until the next time, the Chin Check Radio, signing out.